There's no question that we're living in very strange times, unprecedented times. In fact, we've had an unprecedented number of uses of the word unprecedented to describe the very weird and wonderful times the world's going through. Because of that, I thought I would take 15-20 minutes of your time, if I may, to reflect on three concerns that I have around the way we, particularly in the UK, but throughout the Western world, but in fact throughout the whole world, we're trying to address this question. I don't want to be negative or critical, particularly. I've been in leadership for most of my adult life, and I know how hard it is to be a leader and how easy it is to be a critic when you don't have any responsibility. Nevertheless, I am motivated by some serious passions and long for a number of things to be true about our world, and I think we're in danger of not taking these three issues, among many others, seriously enough. So what are my motivations? I'm motivated by the revolutionary document called John's Gospel, in which Jesus talks repeatedly about truth, about how he is the truth, about how the truth will set you free. And I'm passionate about trying to discover from all the great plethora of information around COVID-19, what's the truth? What can we actually trust to be real? And what at the end of all this are we actually going to be finding out was a bit of flim-flam and chaff in the wind and stuff that people said but actually had no basis in reality. So firstly, I'm really guided by Jesus talking about truth and about how really important it is for everyone to be committed to finding out the truth. And of course, Christians think about this in terms of the truth about Jesus and the gospel realities of his salvation. And in this case, I'm talking about a Christian perspective on some of these big virus issues. So I'm motivated by John's Gospel and its search for truth. And secondly, by a rather obscure passage which has become well known in recent years in the book of Chronicles in the Old Testament, that says, if my people who are called by my name will seek my face and humble themselves and pray, then I'll heal their land. So I'm hoping that this broadcast will result in analysis, thoughtfulness, agreement, disagreement, but a new energy in the search for truth and a commitment to pray, to seek God and to say, only you can intervene in this situation, please do. So I'm motivated by a desire for truth and a desire to encourage those people who are watching this who have Christian faith and who are committed to prayer to pray more powerfully and effectively for our world and our leaders. But the third thing is I'm motivated by a desire to see the kingdom of God come in power. That's what Jesus wanted, a world in which justice and righteousness, honour, all those things mattered. Kindness, love were predominant. Because not only is that a Christian concern, but it's a human concern. And I'm appealing to women and men of goodwill, even those who have no faith at all. Because I believe we want to see a world in which human flourishing is everywhere, where the neediest and the poorest and the most broken are cared for, not just by this odd thing called society, but by individuals within it, like you and me. And so they're the motivations behind what I want to say, both now and in any future broadcasts that I make around this topic. So of these three concerns, what's the first one? Well, number one is this. I am worried, concerned, anxious even, about what this is going to do to societies around the world, to culture, to the way we understand how we are living. Dictatorships around the world have always used enemies, internal or external, as a method for keeping populations under control. When populations have to choose between risk and freedom and security, those issues, they always opt for security and an absence of risk. So if leaders can keep their nations in a state of panic about almost anything, they're much more likely to hug their leaders rather closer, even if they don't particularly like them very much. So I am concerned that as we come out of lockdown, as surely we must, that there will be nations around the world, perhaps not so much in Western countries, but certainly in the developing world, in which leaders who have autocratic tendencies anyway will use this virus for continually restricting freedoms of their people on the grounds of health and security and so on. And so nation after nation where there's been a growing sense of freedom will actually have far less freedom as a result of this. Not just for coming months, but for years and years to come, that the rolled out wave of democratic freedoms around the planet will actually be rowed back and will become a much more controlled, much more illiberal, much more persecuted and pressurized world. And that makes me very concerned for human flourishing, because humans flourish best with measures of freedom to express a philosophical belief, a political belief, a religious belief, a faith belief. And controls on that will be a massive backward step in our world. It's easy to think that I might be exaggerating the threat here, but if you've travelled as much in the world as I have, you know that the tendency of governments, once they've taken away power from the people and imposed controls, it's incredibly difficult for them to give up the habit of expressing control, particularly as they might be criticised for the moment that they express a small giving up of power. Maybe the virus will come back, maybe something else will happen. There could be an excuse for draconian controls in some countries for many years to come. And even here in the West, in Great Britain, for example, we have put up with things that even 3 months ago we would have thought impossible. Signs of a controlling state. We may accept that these things are necessary in the very short term, but we must keep on our guard. We must be prayerful, thoughtful, energetic. The price of our freedom is eternal vigilance. Stories about whether police are going to check what's in your shopping basket, drones over countryside spaces to check whether people are walking in places they shouldn't. A policeman stopping your car, asking where you're going. How are those not signs of a police state? Now, we're not there yet, obviously. But civilization is a very tender plant, a very fragile flower. And our hard-won freedoms over centuries can so easily be eroded. So I'm encouraging all people of goodwill to think about these issues carefully, and to make sure that in our lobbying of our members of parliament, our government officials, both local and national, we take every opportunity we can to talk about getting back, not to quote normal, whatever that's likely to mean in the future, but to make sure that these freedoms are preserved. Now, of course, it matters not just to political opponents of the current governments around the Western world, but this issue of freedom matters very significantly to those who follow Jesus, because we want the freedom to meet, to express our faith. We want the freedom to share our faith with others. We want the freedom to express that. And we've got millions of our brothers and sisters around the world who live already in oppressive regimes, and they are not free to meet openly. They are not free to talk about their faith and to share it. They are deeply constrained, and my fear is that the virus may give governments around the world a massive excuse for clamping down still further on the freedoms of their populations. And here in the West, don't think that we're immune from some of those freedoms being eroded as we move forward. And the second concern is this. It's about the lockdown generally. Now, don't get me wrong, I think no other political parties that are not in power in America or Canada or Australia or Europe or Britain and so on, the opposition parties, I'm not sure they would have done any better through this. This is not a party political point that I'm about to make. And also, I am incredibly grateful for the women and men who serve in our political systems, because let's face it, trust has been eroded in politics in recent years in pretty heavy ways. Politicians appear right, down at the bottom of the scale of occupations that we trust. So I want to say to all those women and men who've been working flat out to find a solution to this, I want to say to you, because as you've appeared on my TV screen from night to night, sometimes you look exhausted. And so I want you to know that you're in our prayers, you and your families. What a tough time you're going through. So thank God for you and the work you're doing. Nevertheless, I do think we ought to ask some tough questions about the lockdown, or as they say on the other side of the pond, about sheltering in place. Because surely an open and transparent society looks at good and bad and unintended consequences of actions much more openly than we seem to be doing anywhere. It's as if our governments believe that if they give any credence for a moment to an alternative view, that there'll be mass civil disobedience. So let it be said early on that I am in favour, as a good citizen, in my case of the United Kingdom, of obeying what the government's asked us to do, of trying to minimise visits away from the house, of only going to my office when I really feel I need to making sure that I don't visit the supermarket, not that I have any desire to visit the supermarket, more regularly than I ought to, and that genuinely I attempt social distancing when I'm out. I think we have a duty as citizens to do those things. But I think we also have a duty to raise the alarm if we feel that there are things that are not being addressed. I worry that party politics sometimes gets so overwhelmed in this. In other words, people are keen to demonstrate that they, the party in power, are doing a good job, that it brooks no dissent or even genuine inquiry of an open and transparent nature. Here in the UK, our daily briefings have at times appeared bizarre, Monty Python-esque in their surreal activity. A minister comes out, makes a statement, a scientist makes another statement, and then they spend their time not answering the questions from the press. No question seems to get a straightforward and simple answer. Now, the press has been very negative and destructive, and that's been argued all over the place, so I won't mention that apart from to agree with that observation. Here in Britain, we've now included questions from members of the public. So what we've got now is a situation in which government ministers who used to not answer questions from journalists are now not answering questions from the public, which I'm not sure is a major step forward. So we've got a situation in which we've got this leadership by motto here in the UK that we've got to stay at home and protect the NHS and save lives. The trouble with government by motto is just because you keep on repeating something doesn't make it any more or less true. It needs to be examined for what it is. It's not at all clear to me, indeed to quite a few people now, that we are in fact saving lives overall. We want to, quote, flatten the curve. But it seems to me that if you flatten the curve, you elongate the process, the same number of people die under the curve, it's just longer at the end and less sharp in its shape. And so, of course, having a lockdown has protected national healthcare systems around the world from being overwhelmed, and everybody agrees, well, that's a good thing, we want that. But it seems that if in fact it's the same number of lives that are likely to be lost from coronavirus, that we have spread out the deaths from COVID-19 and we have protected the NHS from being overwhelmed. Well, okay, one might agree that that was definitely a good thing to do, a goal worth searching for and trying to achieve. But on reflection, it's not that simple, is it? What about the unintended consequences of lockdown, of which there are numerous? What about the optician's appointments that are being missed, and so the development of glaucoma, which causes blindness, is not spotted and irreparable damage is done to the eye? Or even a tumour at the back of the eye is not spotted because no optician's appointments are happening? Or dentists who allow people's teeth to go unexamined. because no one's going. A cancer of the mouth remains unspotted. 2 million regular operations cancelled, routine. They're not routine if they're delayed for very long for some people. What about all the tests? Thousands, hundreds of thousands every week for cancer, heart conditions, diabetes, other significant problems. All of them untreated and undiagnosed. And we know, particularly with cancer, but with most of the things too, the longer you are in getting a diagnosis, the more dangerous the condition becomes, and ultimately, the more terminal the condition is likely to be. And so it seems that what we're likely to get from this is a huge number of deaths over the next year, 2 years, 3 years, which are attributable to lockdown. You might imagine a situation in which, instead of a daily briefing that tells you how many people have died from corona, the government have to have a daily briefing for the next 2 years, every night, that says, today, this number of people died as a result of the lockdown. Now, clearly that's not going to happen, partly because it's so difficult to decide exactly what is due to the lockdown going forward. But the vast numbers of people who are very, very likely to be either seriously ill or die as a result of the lockdown, this seems to me to be unarguable. It was several weeks ago that a Centre for Evidence-Based Medicine in Cambridge made precisely this point. They said there are likely to be more deaths as a result of lockdown than of coronavirus. Our most recent Prime Minister, Theresa May, made that point just this week, saying we don't want the cure to be worse than the disease. And there are not just these physical things. What are all the social challenges? Domestic violence has increased by around 30% during lockdown. Battered women are turning up at A&E in increasing numbers. Consumption of alcohol at home has increased exponentially as pubs are closed. Increased alcohol in social isolation, in close proximity to another family member, invariably leads to violence in the home. And what about violence on children and the exposure they've got to a disgruntled, fed-up father, for example, who's had too much to drink? And what about the issues of mental health that are happening everywhere? People becoming anxious, afraid, sad, troubled, with no one to turn to in these situations. Not to mention the thousands of people who are not going to hospital A&Es, whose admittances are down about 25% around the country. Must be true, 42% of hospital beds seem to be unoccupied in the UK. And so there are social dimensions, mental health struggles, all those physical issues. It's pretty likely that there will be hundreds of thousands of people who may well lose their lives as a result of the lockdown. Now, of course, this doesn't mean either way that the government shouldn't have done what they did. It just means that that is such a serious thing for the well-being of society going forward, such a serious thing, that it ought to be far more openly and transparently discussed, acknowledged by the government. No one thinks the government ought to be perfect. They can't be. But surely we ought to be, for the sake of the health of the nations of the world, just as concerned for the effects of the lockdown, sheltering in place agenda and what that's going to mean. And if you think that's bad in the Western world, and I believe it's potentially very bad, how much worse is it in countries that are developing around the world? Millions could die of starvation around the world because of this situation. And it's not just the unemployment of people in the West that's going to be a problem. Thousands are losing their jobs. Just this week, British Airways announced 12,000 redundancies as a result of this. How can that not be replicated? And if the economy is failing going forward in the future, where will their money be to invest in the National Health Service or in other services if there isn't any tax receipts in large numbers coming into the government and so on? Now, all of this sounds very negative. It's really meant to say a grown-up government with a discussion with a grown-up population must be thinking about these issues, because we deserve as people a chance to engage those questions head on. So my hope and prayer is that there'll be much more openness about some of these things and a recognition that there are choices. Despite the government implying there aren't choices, they keep on saying this phrase which has driven me crazy in these briefings. We are just following the science. Surely they know nobody believes that. And it's not that straightforward. They might be following a science, but the science implies there's just one scientific view. One cabinet minister said of the science group that's advising the government, quote, "The scientists seem to fight like cats. We ask for a scientific view and we get 7. I have read scientific papers and medical papers from as far west as California and as far east as China and throughout Asia, where scientists and medics say different things to the scientific advice our government's following. Surely it's better to say they've chosen to follow a particular set of scientists, some of whom don't have a particularly impressive track record in predicting how many people are going to die of various things. So a touch more humility and transparency is, I think, what I'm pleading for. That way we can try and get to what the truth about all this is. And the third area is really directed to those of my brothers and sisters that I would call the church, who are particularly sharing my Christian faith and my passion for the gospel as this great agent of transformation on planet Earth. I think that Christian leaders largely have done quite well in establishing messages on the internet of care for their congregations and for their fellow Christians. We've emphasised the faith, not fear message. We've talked about verses in the Bible that God is our refuge and strength, that Jesus will be with us and so on, and those are good and positive messages. We've even encouraged people to look out for one another. We've run Zoom services and others which have been really good. But I do have 2 concerns, and maybe I should apply them to myself. I'm a Christian leader. The first concern is that we seem to have bought into a quite insular view of what the Christian message is. Yes, there have been many Christians involved in caring in their communities, and that's a good thing. But I haven't heard many Christian leaders talking about the mission opportunities of COVID-19. How are we to view this in terms of the gospel? People are asking all sorts of questions. Their lives have been turned upside down. Times of transition and turbulence are wonderful times for the gospel of Jesus, because people are looking around for solutions, for security, for help, other than their normal security in work or in family. And what are we doing to make sure the gospel of Jesus is widely spread and communicated? And of course, I think we made a major tactical mistake as a church in closing our buildings. Certainly, we had to stop meeting as congregations because we wanted to honour the instruction that the government gave to us. And it was perfectly right to do that. But very small convenience stores continued to open because they thought of themselves as an essential service. And so they continued, with varying degrees of success, to put arrows on the floors of their stores and to try to create a sense of social distance as best they could, because they viewed themselves as an essential service. But somehow we decided to close our churches at exactly the moment when there were lots of us around with some spare time who could easily have been in the church, set chairs out or arranged for social distancing in pews, encourage people to come on their daily walk for exercise, just to sit in the church for a minute, to pray. We could have handled the social distribution of people and distancing carefully. Once an hour, someone could have prayed or talked about the strength and solace that Christian faith brought, all without transgressing the social distancing. But we decided apparently to close all our churches. And so that put us in the same category as a club or a pub or a leisure centre of some kind. So here we are saying we're colluding with this view that Christianity and the church is just some leisure pursuit, a hobby a few strange people do on a Sunday morning. And so we're just like a club or a leisure pursuit. We're not really an essential service. Instead of saying, no, it matters. The gospel's not on the fringe of society, not a little leisure hobby for people who might want to do it if they're interested in it. Surely we believe that the message of Jesus Christ is life-changing, society-transforming, energizing, essential services. We ought to be positioning ourselves as we're one of those essential services that society needs. Surely we don't believe that the issue is simply physical health and economic success. Haven't we argued about this for years? Why aren't we modelling that we see ourselves as an essential service, that the spiritual health of the nation matters to us? Because we do genuinely believe that a faith in this Jesus, an embracing of this kingdom dynamic, a belief in this life-transforming power does make a difference. And that Jesus, for example, in his kingdom manifesto in Matthew's Gospel, chapters 5, 6 and 7, really, if embraced, would make our world a hugely better place and would make individuals better people and would make all that many of us long for, kindness, care for the poor, care for the broken, care for those on the edges of society who will feel the effects of this virus for years to come in far more profound ways than most of us have with our security and our wealth and our access to power and to all the services that make our life comfortable. So my first broadcast in this area reflects on these three questions. The question of freedom in a society, the question of whether the lockdown is causing more deaths than the virus does, and if that's true, how do we explore that and support our leaders? Because there's no point saying we shouldn't have done it. We're in it now. And we've got to work out how best to get out. How can we pray for them? And how can we help encourage this open conversation? And thirdly, how can the Church of Jesus be a mission agency for goodness and kindness, positioning ourselves as an essential service for society, an essential blessing for community, not because of anything we are, but because the God we say we follow wants people to know his Son and have their lives transformed. So I do pray that you find this stimulating and helpful, and even if you disagree with it, at least that it will make you a searcher after truth and someone who prays and someone who seeks the power of this Jesus and the strength of this gospel to be a different person yourself through the rest of whatever corona crisis will bring to our homes, to our communities, and to our world.